Hello everyone.
Hello everyone from Super Soaraway sunny Royston.
Yeah, and I just noticed something, Jono.
What's that?
I remember doing recording in Cafe Otto when it was also very sunny and we were sitting in when everybody was out. Does that mean we have been doing this for a year or more than a year now?
More than a year, I think. Yes. We're moving into our second year and soon to be into our second decade as well, I would imagine.
Oh, wow. We will talk about the living legend. I want you to pronounce her name.
Suzanne Ciani.
Suzanne Ciani.
And we're listening to one particular album of hers because she's had such a varied career. She's had an incredibly varied career.
So many works,
so many works in so many different phases, different avenues. But this is her album from 1982 called Seven Waves.
Yeah. It was first released in Japan.
Yes, it was.
Why does Japan keep coming back in our themes?
It's very interesting.
Is that why I have to go there soon?
Well, there is the thing, of course, is that the Japanese economy was really super on fire in the 80s. So it was easy for them to invest in stuff like this, perhaps easier than it was even for in the US and definitely in Europe.
All the technology
and the technology as well.
The companies. So it was 80s in Japan was a time when things were being invented or patented, like coming from the US, but still it was Japanese companies like Roland and Yamaha taking on the invention of FM synthesis or making media protocols. So then this is when this album also came out around that time.
I mean, technically, this is one of the really interesting things about this album is that it really exemplifies the sounds of the early 80s.
Very 80s vibes there.
Yes.
But also game audio vibes. But that's another thing to talk about.
Yeah. Well, it's worth remembering that before this phase in Ciani's life, in her career, she'd been working for advertising companies, doing sounds for jingles and very famously for Coca-Cola. But she also did the advertising jingle for Atari computers.
There we go.
So, and that was with her Buchla system.
Yes.
I'm sure we will talk about Don Buchla later, but she had this wonderful synthesizer in New York and she was doing recordings for big Madison Avenue advertising campaigns. But it was at the end of that period that she started on this album. And the technology on this album is really of that period because there's
so many pieces of equipment.
Yeah, and it's just before the DX7 appeared.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so there's no DX7, so there's her Buchla synth from the 70s, from the 60s.
There's Prophet.
And the Prophet 5, which is all over this album. And it's a concept album. It's 7 tracks all about the sea, about the ocean. And the last 2 tracks feature the wonderful, and at the time, very new and cutting-edge TR-808 drum machine.
Oh, did we talk about that? Yes, we did when we were talking about the acid house pioneer.
Exactly. So exactly the same period. So this is the TR-808, which was only manufactured between 1980 and 1983. So this album's right in the middle of that.
Very new equipment for that time.
Yeah.
But also there is this video of Suzanne Ciani appearing in a David Letterman show her Prophet.
Yes.
And, blowing everyone's mind.
Yeah. Well, the great thing about that is that she's using the Eventide H610 harmonizer, which we've talked about, I think, like 50% of our episodes I've mentioned this one piece of equipment because all American music and European music from the late 70s onwards, you can hear this harmonizer. And it's delay and pitch change. And with David Letterman, it was this gag that, he could pitch...
The vocoders and all that.
Yeah, she could pitch his voice down and pitch his voice up in real time.
Yeah, it really looks funny. But she herself has this sense of humor.
Absolutely.
Not only in that show, like when she is a younger woman, you can tell her. That's that sort of approach while being the master of that instrument.
Yeah. So there was the Prophet 5, which was Dave Smith's. Well, Sequential Circuits was the company, but Dave Smith's creation, and Dave Smith, who later went on to invent MIDI.
MIDI protocol, yes.
Yeah. And so she's got the Prophet 5 there, and then, which you hear all over this album, the Eventide Harmonizer, Roland vocoder, another nice Japanese piece of equipment, Marshall Time Modulator. Now, they kind of went out of fashion, but the Marshall Time Modulator was another chorus flangey machine, all analog gear, which was pretty much the sound of a lot of British productions. Martin Hannett allegedly used it on everything. You know, like drums, voices. You hear it, that chorus on everything. And then another weird thing, a polyfusion frequency follower, which was a pitch to CV device, so that she could take external pitches, maybe from her voice, and get her synths to follow it, you know. And these are all the bits of gear in combination with the Buchla and I think a Model D Mini Moog as well.
Okay.
Are all the sounds on this album.
So
it's very distinctive.
So look at this then. What we have covered so far, or early electronic art music, is usually electroacoustic with equipment that was very new for that time. And this album is full of these pieces of equipment. Of course, for her it was very hard to get a Buchla. She had to go and take up work.
But interestingly, the job that she got was working for Don Buchla.
Exactly. So she got her own Buchla synthesizer.
Well, should we just explain for our listeners what the importance of this guy, Don Buchla? Basically, he was one of the three really big synth designers in the US in the late 60s. So there was Bob Moog, Robert Moog, Don Buchla, and Serge Cheretnin. And what's interesting is that for a kind of easy bit of shorthand is that people talk about East Coast and West Coast synthesis. And what they're basically talking about is the differences in approach between Bob Moog on the East Coast and Don Buchla on the West Coast. So Bob Moog was using his synthesizers with keyboards, so they became keyboard instruments for people to play major scales on and whatever, which is what you hear a lot of. Ironically, what you hear a lot of on this album.
I was about to say this, like this album compared to we have a lot of pieces of equipment going on here, but the music is very accessible
and diatonic.
Very diatonic, very traditional,
Major,
very accessible,
and the irony is that Don Buchla, who Suzanne Ciani had worked with and whose synths she was using throughout the 70s, really rejected the idea of the keyboard and wanted synthesizers to be free with voltage control coming from any sources, which is kind of something that I agree with myself, actually, as a
in what way?
thereminist. Well, I'm as a theremin player and originally playing lots of different instruments, I find keyboards very, very limiting. That people find a sound and then play different pitches on the sound rather than finding a sound and then playing different sounds with the sound.
Okay, no, I get it.
So I'm much more on coming from kind of Don's background there. But he was an incredible.
You and Don.
Well, poor old Don passed away 2016.
Before you could share a pint.
Yes, before we could have a pint together. But I've got friends who met Don and said that he was very strange guy.
I'd love to meet you.
Well, Suzanne Ciani met him when she went to Berkeley University in on the other side of the bay from San Francisco.
Yeah, she got to
in 1968, which was the explosion of the whole hippie thing. And Don Buchla was his first synth he was taking on the road with Ken Kesey. He was one of Ken Kesey's merry pranksters. So they had this bus driving around California, probably through a few other states, where they were basically promoting the use of acid, doing lots of acid, turning up and playing free concerts. I mean, I've got a quote from Don Buchla here. Quote, "I just showed up at places with my instruments, took some acid, played some music." Okay,
there you go. That's the spirit. So that's where Suzanne Ciani was active in. Yes. But there's that hippie spirit. But also, she got to learn from some of these composers, Max Matthews, John Shawnee, the computer music guys, because she did take this computer music course in Stanford University.
Yes.
And then with Buchla, she did learn about the hardware and the soldering.
Yeah.
So there's some hippie stuff going on in there, but also so much learning of the techniques.
Well, also, I mean, she is like so many women composers of this period. She gravitated towards electronic music because she was constantly being rejected in the world
being a woman.
for being a woman. I mean, you know, at that time, you know, women, it's very acceptable in classical music to have women as performers. But for conductors and composers, they just weren't taken seriously, and she felt rejected. And rejection, she ended up gravitating towards electronic music. So she had this background in classical music, then in improvised electronic music, and that's one of the special things about Don Buchler's synths is they're designed for live performance. And I mean, I saw Suzanne Ciani performing live with her Buchler 200E in 2018, so that kind of came back again.
Very, very nice. I mean, I don't know when we will put this show out, but I'm going to see her perform at the Union Chapel on the 20th September, and this will be my first time to see her, and my also debut thing to say something in that Islington venue.
Well, it's a really, really nice venue, and also one of the good things about the Buchler synths is they're also, for live improvisation, they have quadraphonic built in.
Oh,
so it will be. It's always projected onto at least 4 channels.
That's going to be amazing. So,
yes.
You were just talking about the classical background. Yeah, this was a composer who was playing the likes of Chopin, and then suddenly she gets into the acid world with her electronics.
Well,
not suddenly.
She said in an interview again in 2018 with Electronic Sound magazine. She said there was a period of 3 years where she didn't wear any shoes, like proper hippie.
You know the hippies.
Yes.
But the proper hippie, because here's the thing. We were talking about East Coast, West Coast, but also all these electronic music moments and studios opening, going on in Europe and Japan, etc. Among them, the hippiest one was the San Francisco Tape Music Center, which also had Pauline Oliveros or the Minimalists.
And Morton Subotnick.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the place where they were more independent or shifting, looking after the studio, the tape center, by doing their shifts rather than getting any private or government support, unlike the European counterparts or the ones in the East Coast who were also doing that sort of thing, but they had the Rockefeller and they had private funding support. Whereas these guys, the hippies in San Francisco Tape Music Center, they were doing that sort of very independent. They had this indie spirit, and she got to interact with that scene
and sharing a lot of ideas. Obviously, I mean, this is the thing with her career. Her career is so interesting because it's gone through all these different phases. So there was this classical composer, then the dissatisfaction from that, then the start of the hippie thing, then the electronic music, then getting her own Buchler synth to be able to do live shows and working with Don Buchler, and then once she had that synth for doing live performances, she then just upped sticks and moved to New York. Was essentially living homeless here at synth, doing live performances in art galleries and stuff like that.
Wow.
And that's when she started working with, or at least met or did some work with people like Philip Glass and Ornette Coleman.
Oh, the Minimalists.
Yeah. And then she got drawn into doing the music for advertising, which of course paid for everything.
Exactly. That's how she made her living. The jingles and the soundtrack with her work. And don't we hear a combination of all these things in this album in a way? Okay, we said it's like diatonic, very accessible and traditional. Yet, even the, ocean wave sounds that they're not field recordings.
Yeah.
They are basically this album. Okay, here's the thing. The previous episode we talked about another work with, the sounds of season and nature. But here you hear this fate, ocean wave sounds, and that's what she does. It's a recurring theme in the album, but it's not a field recording. It's like it's almost like this is what this instrument is capable of doing, sort of a statement. but then we can hear all the chordal or arpeggiation, more of the classical approaches, but then there is this constant moving of electronic waves.
I've listened to it a couple of times, and there was one point I was listening to it quite quietly, and when you listen quite quietly, there's other ambient noise going on around you. The sea effects that she's made just with with a couple of filters and a noise generator and some clever panning. It's really quite convincing. It was like a couple of times I was like, hang on, is that a field recording? And then you go back and check, and then no, it really is just...
I had to look it up, honestly, myself. I thought if she went onto the ocean and recorded the sounds. No, it wasn't.
Particularly on track 2, it was really kind of quite convincing.
The second wave, Sirens.
Yes, particularly on Sirens on track 2, the sea sounds...
There's a lot of filtering going on there.
Filtering,
that's the subtractive synthesis thing being in action. And all these sequencing approaches just reminds me a whole different region that is going to take me to Berlin School. The sequences, there are these sequencing, it's not like Klaus Schulze or Tangerine Dream kind of sequencing, but there is some sequencing at play here, as opposed to the classical way. The patterns are much closer to traditional strings of notes and on paper.
A real background all the way back is a piano player.
Piano, yes, that's Chopin. She was playing romantic.
And you can hear there's a soloistic kind of virtuosic soloing going on with the synths a couple of times.
Yeah, that sort of improvisational arpeggio sections.
And there's also
especially in Love in the Waves, which is the third piece.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, is it a bit of a nod to Wendy Carlos, in that, particularly in the first piece, that there's these sort of Baroque compositional devices like the circle of fifths and stuff happening. And at that time, polyphonic synths, it was basically every synth just played one note at a time. You could only play single lines. And that Baroque music fitted that because it was polyphonic rather than playing chords. And like fugues and single lines, in making complexity that way in a kind of linear sense rather than in blocks of harmony. So there's a little kind of nod there to the music of Bach in the way that it's constructed.
Another classical.
Lots of classical allusions in this, because that's her background. But I mean, for me, a really big reference point in all this, especially on the last two pieces on 6 and 7, when the drum machine comes in. Is there's a strong sort of jazzy African American flavour.
Could it be because of all the New York or maybe or previous life in San Francisco influences?
Well, the US is such a cultural, multicultural, cultural.
New Orleans somewhere. New Orleans.
Well, I think she did like road trips. I think she went on road trips in her hippie period.
Yeah.
And really did know the whole of the States, So she was originally East Coast, then moved to the West Coast, then moved back to the East Coast, and I had travelled in the South. Yeah. But you can't be part of contemporary American culture without being heavily influenced by African American culture,
Yeah.
And that comes through here. I mean, I really got the feeling that track 6, which I just think does feature the booklet. You can imagine Whitney Houston singing on it, or even Marvin Gaye. I mean, you think of one of the most famous uses.
It's a very accessible album.
Yeah, but one of the most iconic uses of the TR-808 drum machine is Marvin Gaye's "Sexual Healing," and there's a feeling of that in this album.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I think in the final track.
The drummy one. The
very drummy towards the end. And it's not just the 808. There's other drums that she's synthesised with the Prophet and possibly with the booklet as well. And vocoders as well.
And TR-808 also?
And the TR-808, yes.
Of course.
Yes, pumping away.
There's a lot of vocoders.
Yes, yeah.
And all this then very modern pieces of equipment.
Yeah. The record company that released this album, I mean, it was originally released, as you mentioned before, it was originally released
in Japan.
In Japan by Victor JVC. But it was a US label, Finadar, that picked it up. And this was the label that was created by İlhan Mimaroğlu.
İlhan Mimaroğlu, Turkish pioneer.
The Turkish pioneer who had set up a label to release electronic music pieces or contemporary music pieces, Stockhausen and John Cage. And who had also released the Cage and Luciano Berio, that first album of electronic music. And he picked up this album, released it. So there was this sense that although this is extremely accessible and has links with popular culture, going as far as Whitney Houston and Marvin Gaye, that it was actually released on a label that was set up for really classical electronic music,
electronic art music. But this has all these influences of new age techno or even krautrock sometimes. I mean, I'm talking about the kosmische music. About the Berlin school influences.
Yeah. But it's interesting now with her career is that what she's doing now is working with the equipment, an updated version of the equipment that she worked with in the early 70s. From 1968 to 74, which was with the Buchla system.
Yeah.
And this whole period of this album, then followed by the very pianistic new age stuff, but literally music specifically designed for particular meditations, really kind of hippie stuff. That's all kind of gone now, and she's back to where she was then, which frankly is more up my street. What she's doing now is I find much more interesting than that.
I think I agree. Although, I mean, this album. If you put this album aside, and if you talk about also all the commercial work she was doing. When we look into, it's something I studied in my thesis very extensively about chiptune, 8-bit music, and early game audio. So it was all about trying to sound like other existing music. Not all about that, but then they were trying to do it, and they were not even composers. They were mostly the programmers who did make sound for these late 80s games or early 90s games with very limited programmable sound generators, which is like you don't even some of the gaming consoles did not even have their own sound chips, but then they were invented and they were called programmable sound generators.
Yes.
So.
With little ROM chips that you could just stick them in.
Very limited options of just pulse wave or white noise sounds.
Mm.
So she was actually, we can say, that part of Atari generation.
Well, she composed the promo for the Atari. You just reminded me, she composed the soundtrack for a game for a pinball machine. Mm-hmm. So this is pre-gaming, but what she was doing was she was composing sounds that were then recorded as digital audio onto little ROMs.
Well, the game audio to start with did not have sound to start with. I mean, Pong, that was like in the 70s. That was the game to have sound for the first time as it is known. So when was this created?
Let's have a look. This would be early 80s.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's not the first one, but still it's very, very early.
Yes, yeah. And we'll put a link to this in because this is a really delightful little film of her composing for a pinball machine.
Well, this is like the soundtrack. Okay, I need to make this difference here. I'm talking more about the sounds in the game audio.
This is sounds in the game. This
is also the game audio. Yeah. More like the in Commodore 64 or Nintendo Entertainment System, when you play the game, like all the sounds generated with the very, very limited sound chips. The NES one, the NES one didn't even have its own dedicated sound chip. It was all in the CPU and all that stuff. So, okay, here's another thing. Like we said, she has so many phases and things and variations of things, and this is one of them, in a way, the game audio and soundtrack work.
Yeah, very important. And also, ironically enough, her work was being heard by millions upon millions of listeners.
Yeah.
But, she wasn't being credited, and that's another link.
Sorry, we keep reopening this.
But that's another link with Delia Derbyshire. In the Delia Derbyshire as a composer, working for the BBC, but the majority of her compositions were nameless station IDs, for BBC radio stations or little bits of audio for TV shows and stuff.
Amazing. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, and look up these fabulous little pieces on YouTube.
Yeah, it's not just the album we covered, just there are so many things to look up about Suzanne Ciani.
Yeah, with such a massive, varied career.
Yeah, a living legend and still being updated. That's amazing. Like, even when you're about to reach your 80 years of age, you're still, changing things in the way you make music.
Well, regarding her age, I mean, a friend of mine who saw her recently said he was very impressed with her flexibility. She was taking a full bow with straight legs, so she's obviously keeping up with the yoga.
So you pay attention to that, but that would draw my attention too. Yoga and maybe the early hippie stuff. Yeah, right.
See you soon.
See you soon.